Welcome to the podcast, Let the Prophets Speak. Today we continue our study of the second book of Chronicles with chapter 24, that is Divrei Hayomim Beis, Parak Chof Dalid. We are reading of the reign of King Yoash. We read of the spectacular and wonderful restoration of the crown to the house of David in the last chapter 23, where Yehoyadah, the high priest, managed to overthrow Queen Atalia and replace her on the throne with Yoash, who was a young child, as king. Yehoyadah was the mastermind. The high priest was the mastermind behind this entire operation. And we will learn more of his relationship with Yoash, the now king, in this upcoming chapter 24. Ben Sheva Shonim Yoash b'malko. Yoash was 7 years old when he became king. V'arboim shana malach b'Yerushalayim, and he ruled for a total of 40 years in Jerusalem. V'shem imo Tzivya mi Be'er Sheva, and his mother's name was Tzivya from Beersheba. Vayas Yoash hayashor be'enei Adonai kol yimei Yehoyadah HaKohen. As long as Yehoyadah the Kohen, the high priest, was alive and was the high priest, Yoash did what was proper in the eyes of God. In other words, he followed the leadership and teaching and guidance of Yehoyadah the high priest, who managed to restore the house of David to the monarchy and rededicated the people to God, as we saw in the last chapter. And Yoash did what he was supposed to do, and led the people in the proper path. And one of the greatest examples, one of the greatest things that he did, we're about to read. Vayisa lo Yehoyadah nashim shtayim. Yehoyadah found for him and arranged for the matches with 2 wives, Vayoled banim ubanos, and he had sons and daughters. So the family of the Judean monarchy was reestablished and thriving. It became Yoash the king's desire to renew and restore the house of God. The temple had fallen into significant disrepair, and he therefore decided it was time to renew it and renovate and fix and re-established the house of God, the temple. And he gathered the priests and the Levites, and he told them, Tzu'ul arei Yehuda, go out to the cities of Judah, v'kivtzu mikol Yisrael kesef, and gather funds from everywhere, l'chazek et beit Elohechem, in order to strengthen the house of God, the house of your God, midei shana b'shana. Do this every year on a regular basis. V'atem timaru ladavar, and hurry up and do this. V'lo mi'aru alavim, but the Levites did not hurry to do it. They were not that intent on doing this. Now, based on the version of the story told in Kings and the understandings of various commentaries, we can understand this hesitation from several angles. Number one, the Levites did not necessarily relish the job of running around being tax collectors. And number two, the people did not exactly want to give the Levites money because of their history of corrupt leadership. And when you have tax collectors going around collecting money, how much of the funds is really going to end up in the right place? So this plan was not the best of plans. So Vayikra HaMelech LiYehoyadah HaRosh, the king then called Yehoyadah, who was the leader of the priests, he was the high priest, Vayomer, and he said, Madua lo darashta al alvim, why are you not making sure that the Levites do their job? Why are you not Al-Havim Yehuda Yerushalayim to raise funds from Judah and from Jerusalem at Masas Moshe Eved Adonai, the burden or the tax which Moshe had placed upon the people? We know that Moshe mentioned, gave us the commandment from God in the Torah to collect a half shekel from each person. Why are you not making sure this happens? V'hakohol liYisrael, L'oel ha'idus, right? That he was supposed to collect from the congregation, from all the people of Israel, in order for them to donate it to the ark, the tent of the covenant, the tent which represents the relationship between the people and God. And why was this necessary? Verse 7, Ki atalyo amirshat, because the evil Atalia, Bonel, Partsuet Beis Elohim, her children, her family had destroyed the house of God. They had broken into the house of God and defiled it. Begam kol koche Beis Adonai asula ba'alim. And all of the holy items they used for their idol worship in the house of Baal. So Vayomer HaMelech, and the king had another idea. Instead of relying upon tax collectors, which was obviously not working, probably for the reasons which we stated before, the people were not interested in giving to what they suspected might be a corrupt system. And the Levites were not really interested in this job of forcing people to give money. So Vayitnu Bishar, he decided, and he said, let us make a box, a large chest, Vayitnu Bishar Beis Adonai Chutza, and put it in the just outside the gate, the entrance way to the temple. So we'll make a big box, and people will voluntarily put it in the box. And because it's out in public, everyone sees what's happening with the money. The potential for corruption is much less. Vayitnu kol b'Yehuda v'Yerushalayim, and the announcement went out in Judah and in Jerusalem. Lihavila Adonai, to bring to God Masat Moshe Eved Elohim al Yisrael b'Midbar, the burden or the tax which Moshe, the servant of God, had imposed upon the people in the wilderness that they were supposed to donate to the temple. And the leadership and the nation, in other words, the people who didn't want to do the job of collecting, and the nation who didn't want to do the burden of giving money to the collectors, they were all very happy with this arrangement. And they came and they threw their money, their donations, into this box until the box was completely full. When the chest full of money was brought by the command of the king, the chest that was made by the command of the king was brought by the Levites to the king. And when they saw kirava kasef, that there was a significant amount of money, uva sofer hamelach ufekid kohen arosh, and the king's scribe and the head Kohen. So there was two people doing this. So again, to reduce the risk of corruption. V'aru et ha'aron, and they emptied out the chest of the money, vayisa'uhu, and then they carried, so they did that in the presence of the king, in public, so people would see what happens with the money, and it was recorded by the scribe. So there was many safeguards in place to make sure that the money was properly used. And then they carried the now newly empty box, vayishivu el makamo, and they returned it to its place. Ko asu liyom b'yom, they would do this every single day. Vaya asu chesef larov, and they thus gathered a significant amount of money. Vayitneu hamelach v'Yehoyadah, and the king and Yehoyadah gave this money, Elosei melechas avodas beis Adonai, to those who are going to do the work in the temple, the work of restoring the temple. Vayu sochrim, and they hired chotzvim, carpenters, v'charashim. Chotzvim is people that work with stones, v'charashim, and carpenters that work with wood. L'chadesh beis Adonai, to fix and renew and restore the house of God. They also hired those that work with bronze and iron, to strengthen the house of God. And the workers did all of their work, and the work went in a proper way. The restoration work went proper in their hands. They did it a good job. And they restored. They stood it up. In other words, there was places where it was collapsing. They firmed up its foundations, firmed up its walls, its roofs, etc., back on its foundations, and they made it a strong, healthy building. And when they finished their work, Hevi'u lifnei hamelach, they brought before the king Yehoyadah et Sha'ar HaKesef, the remaining money. Rather than somehow stealing it or taking it for themselves, they brought it back to the king and the high priest by Aseu Kalim Lebeis Adonai, and they used that money to make vessels for the house of God, Klei Shares, vessels of service in the temple, V'ha'alot, V'chapot, and buckets, and ladles, Uchlei Zahav, and golden vessels, v'chasef, and silver vessels, v'ayu ma'alim olot beveit Adonai tamid kol yimei Yehoyadah, and they were bringing the proper sacrifices and the services in the house of God as long as Yehoyadah was alive. However, Yehoyadah, who was obviously much older than the king, he had raised the king, became old, Vayizkan Yehoyadah, and Yehoyadah lived to an old age, Vayispa Yamim, and when he had completed his days in this world, Vayamos ben Meo Shloshim Shana B'moso, he was 130 years old when he passed. He lived a long, ripe life to a ripe old age, and he passed away. Vayikperu v'ir David im hamlachim, and they buried him in the city of David together with the kings, ki asatova b'Yisrael, because he had done this great deed, v'im halohim, and with God uveso, and God's house, because he had restored the house of David to its proper place. They gave him a honored place at burial near the kings of David, of the house of David. However, now Yehoyadah, who was the one who had so much influence over Yoash's behavior and Yoash's loyalty to God, now that he's gone, we will unfortunately see a change in Yoash's behavior. And after Yehoyadah passed away, Bo'u Sarei Yehuda, the Sarei Yehuda, the officers of Judah, came by Yishtachvu LaMelech, and they bowed to the king. Oz Shoma HaMelech Alehem, and the king listened to them as they bowed to him. One gets the idea that he was taken by pride, by arrogance, by pride. Oh, they're all bowing to me. Now I'm the big guy in charge. I don't need Yehoyadah anymore. He's gone. And of course, arrogance leads to rebellion against God. Vayazvu et beit Adonai Elohei avosehem, and they abandoned the temple of God. Vayavdu et Asherim, and they went back to worshiping the Asherim, the pagans, v'eto Atzabim, and the idols, and and there was anger against Judah and Jerusalem because of their rebellion, because of this terrible deed that they had done. And God sent prophets to inspire them and bring them back to God. And they gave them rebuke, and they told them what they were doing wrong, so God gave them forewarning, but they didn't listen. V'ruach Elohim lovsha, and one of these prophets was a special prophet, at Zechariah ben Yehoyadah HaKohen. This is the prophet Zechariah, not the same as the prophet Zechariah of the book of Zechariah, which is much later in history, in the early Second Temple period, but this is the earlier prophet Zechariah, who was the son of Yehoyadah. He was a Kohen. He was the son of the Yehoyadah who had just passed away. Vaya'amod me'al ha'am, and he stood over the people. In other words, he stood in high places, in the markets, in the temple, to address the people. Vayomer lem, and he said, Ko amar alim, so says God, Lama atem overem es mitzvos Adonai v'lo tatzlichu. Why are you disobeying the words of commandments of God? You will not be successful on this path. This will lead to destruction. Ki azavtem es Adonai vayazov eschem. When you abandon God, He will abandon you, and this is going to lead to a no good place. Vayiksheru alav, the people conspired against him. Vayirgemuhu even b'mitzvas hamelach, and under command of the king was against the Zechariah, who is the son of the one who established him back in his monarchy, and spit it right back in his face, and they threw stones at him, but Chatzar Beis Adonai, in the courtyard of the temple itself, and killed him by stoning him in the temple itself. The terrible irony being that Yehoyadah, his father, refused to allow murder to take place in the temple, even of the evil Atalia who deserved it. And now these people are murdering a righteous person in the temple of God. Of course, it's the famous legend, the rabbinic tradition of the blood of Zechariah, of this boiling on the floor of the temple for years to come, from this time moment of this terrible deed all the way till the end of the temple. When the temple was destroyed by the Romans, it was there to remind the people of the terrible deed that they had done, how the people turned against the prophet who was trying to help lead them in the right direction. And the king himself ordered this. V'lo zochar Yoash melech hachesed, and Yoash the king did not remember, did not recall the kindness asher aso Yehoyadah aviv imo, that his father Yehoyadah had done with him. He did not have any gratitude towards Zechariah, who was the son of the man who established his kingdom by arrogant beno, and he killed his son. Uchemoso amar yireh Adonai v'yidrosh. And as he was dying, as Zechariah was dying, Zechariah said the words, God will see this, and God will seek vengeance from he who is guilty of this terrible deed of my murder. And it was at the end of that year during which this terrible deed took place, and this is a theme that runs through the book of Chronicles. When the people turn away from God, the enemy attacks, and the people are vulnerable. The armies of the Arameans, an enemy that we heard about before, from the time of Achaziah, who was Joash's father, Vayabo el Yehuda v'Yerushalayim, and they came and raided Judah and Jerusalem, Vayashchisu es kol sorei ha'am me'am, and they wiped out all of the leaderships of the people, v'chol shlolam, and they took all of their booty, v'shilchu l'melech Damasek, and they sent it to the king who is in Damascus. Ki v'mitzar anoshim ba'u chel Aram. The armies of Aram came with just a small army, just a small group of men. Nonetheless, they were successful in their raid against Jerusalem. God gave them a huge amount, a huge amount of of um, of soldiers. The huge army fell in front of this small army of Aram. Why? Because they had abandoned God, the Lord of their fathers. V'et Yoash asu shvatim, and they even tortured Yoash the king as well. And when they left him, when this Aramean army left Yoash, they left him wounded and battered and crushed after he was tortured. Hitkashru alav abadav, his servants, his advisors, conspired against the king. They saw how weak the king had become, how he allowed the capital to fall into the hands of a small army of invaders, and embarrassed the kingdom so much that the king himself was tortured by the enemy. And they saw that he had killed, right, the son of Yehoyadah, who had saved the kingdom. He became an extremely unpopular king, so much so that his closest advisors conspired against him. Bidmei b'nei Yehoyadah, because, like we just said before, of the blood of the children, or the child of Yehoyadah, the prophet Zechariah, who had killed by Yargu al mitaso, and they killed him while he lay recovering from his wounds. Vayamos, and he died. Vayikbaru b'ir David, and they buried him in Ir David. V'lo kivaru b'kirot hamelchim, but they did not bury him among the burial places of the kings. So they buried him near the place of the kings, but not in one of the places of which was allotted for the kings, similar to his grandfather Yehoram, who was also a king that died in shame and died in failure. Not similar to Yehoyadah, his teacher, who wasn't even a king but was buried with the kings because of his honorable behavior and his honorable deeds. And the names of the people who conspired against him and led this coup were as follows: Zavod ben Shim'ot ha'Amonit, a man by the name of Zavod, who was the son of Shim'ot, who was an Ammonit, V'Yehozavad ben Shimrit ha'Moavit. And this is interesting that both of these seem to have been children of of at least women who did not come from, or not Israelites to begin with. So the conspirators that killed the king were of mixed lineage and weren't even completely Judean, which is an interesting thought the way this played out. Ubanov Yerev um, Hamasa Olav Visod Beis Elohim, as regarding his children and regarding the Masa Olav, which is a little tough to translate, right? But regarding the burdens and issues and problems and troubles that related to his career is probably the best way to translate this. Visod Beis Elohim, and his reestablishing the house of God, Hinam Ksuvim, they are all written about Al Midrash Sefer HaMelachim, in the story of the Book of Kings, right? Vayimloch Amatzyahu v'no tachtav, and his son Amatzyahu became king in his stead. And the people conspired to kill the king, but they did not want to reestablish a new monarchy. They gave the kingdom to his son Amatzyahu, and we will read in chapter 25 of the reign of his son Amatzyahu, a slight movement in the right direction, at least slight. So Yoash, a mixed bag. The beginning of his career under the influence of Yehoyadah led the people properly and led a rebuilding and a reestablishment and refurbishing of the Beit HaMikdash, of the temple, but then ended his life in shame and failure because of his arrogance. Thank you so much for studying chapter 24 with me. Looking forward to studying chapter 25, to reading about the reign of the next king of Yehuda, Amatzyahu, and of course, the entire book of Chronicles together. Have a wonderful day.